University, for joining us today for the third in a series of webinars we've been conducting this spring. Just a few technical points. Your webcams have been disabled and your mics are not turned on. So if you want to ask questions, you can submit them to the professors using the Q&A section. And we'll monitor those questions as we go and try to work them in. We also have a technical assistant on hand who can help you if you're having any issues with the WebEx platform. Just right-click on her name and select chat to communicate with her. The subject of today's program is the Cold War, how best to deal with the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. We'll be focusing on two documents with differing perspectives on that subject, Henry Wallace's The War and Peace and George Kennen's Long Telegram. Joining us today to discuss this topic are two Ashland University professors who may be familiar to you if you attended our previous webinars. Dr. John Mosier participated in our first, Dr. David Hadley, who joined us last week. So, gentlemen, you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
I am ready. So what we agreed to do is I was going to sort of walk you through Kennen's Long Telegram and then turn things over to Professor Hadley, who will take you through the Wallace speech, and then we'll leave something like 15 to 20 minutes for questions. That seemed to work last time I did one of these. So Kennen's Long Telegram, this is a pretty important document. And I feel like I should start by saying something about who George Kennen was. He's known today as the father of containment, which was the general strategy that was applied by the United States during the Cold War. It's not to say it was always applied in the same way, but the general kind of strategy was called containment. And it's a little bit odd because Kennen would spend a bunch of his career trying to run away from it, claiming that subsequent presidents never really understood what he was trying to get at. So who was he? Well, as a young man, Kennen had attended Princeton. He was a smart guy, but he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life. He had an uncle who had served in the Foreign Service. In fact, he was ambassador to Russia. And so he decided after a tour of Europe that he wanted to follow in his uncle's footsteps. So he joined the Foreign Service, but he took a very different approach. For one thing, he was one of the very few that wanted to focus on Russia. It wasn't considered a popular area of study, but after all, his uncle had been ambassador to Russia, so he was interested. And he was sent to Riga. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, the United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate government. So there were no U.S. diplomats operating in the Soviet Union. So instead, he operated in the city of Riga. Riga is Latvia or Estonia, whatever. But he's right there outside, almost in the Soviet Union, but very close. And Riga was kind of a listening post for trying to pay attention to what was going on in the Soviet Union without actually being there. Another way that Kennen behaved very differently from other diplomats was that whereas traditionally, if you were going to enter the Foreign Service, you would learn a lot of technical details about the country where you expected to be an expert, trade statistics and that sort of thing. Well, for Kennen, he was less interested in those aspects than he was in what we might call a humanistic approach to his subject. So he immersed himself in Russian history, Russian literature. He learned how he became so fluent in Russian that, by his own telling, you could not have told the difference between him and a native speaker. That he studied so much about about Russian history and Russian literature that he felt like he was really able to get into the Russian mind. You see it reflected here. He was first assigned to the embassy in the 1930s after the Franklin Roosevelt administration finally recognized the Soviet government, and he was there during World War II. And unlike most American diplomats during World War II, Kennen was sounding a pessimistic note about the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, He never said, no, we shouldn't be working with the Soviet Union, because he always recognized that Nazi Germany is really, really awful, and doesn't matter who he the Soviet Union is so important that we should certainly work with the Soviets now. He was always warning that in the long term we cannot count on friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Basically, there are going to be lots of areas of distrust now, and after the Axis is defeated in World War II, things are going to go, relations are going to be bad again. And you really see this reflected in the long telegram, which began, he wrote this because the State Department wanted to know why the Soviet Union wasn't playing ball with the United States. In spite of numerous agreements, especially on trade, the Soviets, by late 1945, showed no particular indication they were going to cooperate with the United States. And at this point, Kennen's basic view is, you see, this is exactly how I told you they were going to be. And he crafted his long telegram. You were reading a very short version of it. It was thousands of words, and it was probably about it was more than twice this length. What you're seeing here is just a fairly brief excerpt, trying to explain what we can expect from the Soviet Union. All right, that's enough introduction. The USSR still lives in antagonistic, capitalistic encirclement with which in the long run there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. He gets that critical line right out there in front. The Soviets believe their system and our system cannot coexist peacefully. And there's nothing, furthermore, that we can say to change that fact. They expect that the world is going to divide into Soviet leadership and US leadership. But the good news for the Soviet Union is capitalism creates enemies within it. So US and Great Britain, US and France, France and Britain, etc., are always going to be squabbling. And that means that the Soviet Union can exploit those divisions. But look what's going on here. Under D, intervention against USSR, while it would be disastrous to those who undertook it, would cause renewed delay in progress of Soviet socialism and must therefore be forestalled at all costs. Let me make sure you're all clear on this. This is not his opinion. This is Kennen saying what the Soviets believe. So the Soviets do not want war, and this is very important for understanding Kennen. They're going to try a lot of funny business, but they're going to stop short of war. In the meantime, they're going to try to provoke conflicts between capitalist states. They are going to work with communist parties in other countries. In fact, communist parties in other countries were taking orders from the Soviet Union. This is all under F here. Certain other elements, now described for tactical reasons as progressive or democratic, who are quote unquote objectively favorable to the USSR. So these are groups that don't call themselves communists, but they're going to act as though they are agents of communism. They are going to serve the interests of the Soviet Union. The big enemy are the non-communist left. Right? They hate the communists hate the non-communist left worse than they hate the most conservative Republican. Why? Because they are false friends of the people. They're more dangerous than out-and-out reactionaries because they try to fool the working class, whereas the working class needs to understand that only communists have their interests at heart. So they're going to try to increase the strength of the Soviet Union. They're going to try to undermine the West, but they're not going to provoke a war. So now he goes on to say, where does this come from? It's not that the Russian people believe it. It's not the natural outlook of the Russian people. To the extent that Kennen was able to interact with Russians, and he was from once in a while, he said they don't hate America at all. But it doesn't matter what they think because the Soviet leaders are all that matters. The Soviet Union is not a democracy. So we have to deal with the leadership. Sorry, Russian people. We know you like us, but nothing you guys can do. Also, he says, all these premises that I told you about that the Soviets believe, they're not true, right? Of course, there can be coexistence between capitalism and communism. We cooperated during World War II. Right? There's no reason we couldn't keep going. We don't have to change the Soviet system. The Soviets don't have to try to change our system. What's the problem? Where does it come from? Now he reaches into Russian history. This is on page 3. At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. By the way, if you're wondering where definite articles go sometimes in this, remember that it's a telegram, and this was probably really expensive to send. But if you could cut out unnecessary words, that helps limit the cost. So, Russian sense of security, Russian sense of insecurity, and it's not from communism. It goes way back before communism, back to the days when Russians were, quote, a peaceful and agricultural people trying to live on a vast exposed plain in neighborhood of fierce nomadic peoples. Under the Tsars, Russia expanded in all directions. There were no real geographic barriers to Russian expansion, but every time they conquered one area, there was another dangerous area beyond that also required conquest. So how did communism end up in this mix? He says it's the most natural thing in the world that Russian intelligentsia, right, intelligent, educated Russians, would turn to communism. Only in this land, which had never known a friendly neighbor, or indeed any tolerant equilibrium of separate powers, either internal or international, could a doctrine thrive which viewed economic conflicts of society as insoluble by peaceful means, right? Russia was ripe for communism because communism taught that there's no peaceful coexistence between capitalism and communism. Under communism, the proletariat, the working masses rise up and they destroy the bourgeoisie that has been oppressing them and create a whole new society. There's no compromise. There's no cooperation among the classes. They're just friends whom you stand by and the enemies whom you must destroy. And so now, armed with communism, Russia is in a way more dangerous than it has been before. And this refers to a section that's not really, it's not in the excerpts you have, but it's worth mentioning. Because when you had the czars ruling over Russia, right, people in other countries aren't going to get excited. Oh, yeah, Russian expansion. We think that's a really good idea. No, stay behind your borders and don't mess with us. But with communism, you've got this idea that in some ways sounds kind of virtuous. Oh, equality. The poor are going to be lifted up. They're going to have power, and we're going to share all the wealth. These are beautiful things. So now you have intellectuals in other countries who are willing to say, maybe this communism is something that we ought to try. And in doing that, they're actually serving the cause of the Soviet Union. Okay. What does this mean on an official level? Well, the Soviets are going to do official stuff, of course, official government actions. But the really important stuff is what they're going to do underground, right? These organizations, communist parties in other countries, organizations that don't even call themselves communist, but they take orders from the Soviet Union. Their whole policy is going to be to try to make trouble. The Soviet government is pretty simple. It's going to try to increase the power of the Soviet Union, but it's going to be through these unofficial channels that you're going to see a real politics of division going toward colonial. And this is D on page. Where are we now? Page 4. Toward colonial areas and backward or dependent peoples. Soviet policy, even on official plane, be directed toward weakening of power and influence and contacts of advanced Western nations. So they're going to try to stir up trouble in colonies. Okay, so moving on here. Okay, here's the real subterranean part. This moves on to page 5. What are they going to do? What are these organizations that answer to the Soviet Union going to do? Well, they're going to try to cause division. They're going to try to weaken power and influence of Western powers over colonial, backward, or dependent peoples. They are going to try to bring down governments that seem strong and independent. They're going to sow discontent. They're going to stir up the poor against the rich. They're going to stir up black against white, et cetera, et cetera. Anything they can do to undermine the unity and strength of the non-communist world. All right. So now we get to part 5 here. Practical deductions from standpoint of U.S. policy. Right, first, he reviews. He says there can be no permanent modus vivendi, right? No way of getting along with the United States as far as the Soviets are concerned. So we can't even really try to do that because they're just going to, if we extend an olive branch, they're just going to throw it back in our faces. The Soviet Union is going to work to strengthen its own power and undermine the power and unity of the rest of the world. Oh, there's this one quote here that I just have to point to. This is on the sorry, I can't tell offhand what okay, this is on the bottom, toward the bottom of page 6. Yeah, at the very bottom of page 6 and on to the next page. For it, that is the Soviet Union, the vast fund of objective fact about human society is not, as with us, the measure against which outlook is constantly being tested and reformed, but a grab bag from which individual items are selected arbitrarily and tendentiously to bolster an outlook already preconceived. Okay. There's a lot of verbiage there. What does it mean? He says, in our world, right, if we have an idea about something, oh, I think the weather is nice today. We'll look out the window, and if we see, actually, it's kind of nice. Let's imagine it's the way it was 10 minutes ago, cloudy and maybe hail or locusts or rain of fire or whatever has been going on whatever the last weather phenomenon. We can look out the window and say, oh, that's what it really is. I was mistaken in my initial assessment, right? We have this thing that we have these things called objective facts that we resort to determine whether or not we're wrong. That's not how it works in the Soviet Union. They'll gather a collection of facts. They will pick the facts that suit their worldview, and they will push the rest of the facts aside. In fact, they will probably throw people in prison who try to mention those facts. So this is important because this shows Kennen that we're not really going to be able to negotiate in good faith with the Soviets. I mean, look, you can do day-to-day negotiations, fine, but you're not going to be able to sit down and say, all right, what do we need to do to improve relations? Because we're, in a way, speaking a whole different language, and obviously not English versus Russian, all that's part of it. We just have different ways of looking at the world, and we're not going to be able to communicate with one another by appealing to objective facts. Because for the Russians, there's no real thing. All right. But there's some good news. As it says on page 7, 1, Soviet power, unlike that of Hitlerite Germany, is neither schematic nor adventuristic. It does not work by fixed plans. It does not take unnecessary risks. Impervious to logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does, when strong resistance is encountered at any point. This is a critical line. Remember, one of Kennen's assumptions is the Soviets don't want war. And they're not adventuristic the way Hitler was. Say a tiny bit about Hitler. Hitler was a hypochondriac who thought he was going to die at any time. but that he had a historic mission to accomplish for Germany and time was running out. So he had this timetable. We got to do this now. We have to take Austria. We have to overrun Czechoslovakia, invade Poland, dot, dot, dot. Everything has to follow the plan. The Soviets don't think like that. They believe, as good Marxists, that the communist victory in which the proletariat overthrows and destroys the bourgeoisie is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just going to take time. So for this reason, if they, and that combined with the fact that they don't want war, if they encounter resistance, they're going to say, okay, we'll back off. Time is on their side. Soviet side is weaker. This number 3 is really important too. We don't know in the long term if the Soviet system can survive. Right? There was, when Lenin died, the first leader of the Soviet Union, there was like a 15-year period of that's a bit of an overstatement, but there was a period of instability where no one knew who was really going to come out on top. It may well be that when Stalin dies or retires, there's going to be another big crisis. We don't know how long this system can last, and that's a good thing. We think our system in the United States works just fine, and it's worked just fine for a long time. But their system might be forced to change. Now, all that we need to cover now is on the last page. What do we have to do? Understand what's going on, right? Study the Soviet Union with the same courage, detachment, objectivity, and the same determination not to be emotionally provoked or unseated by it, with which a doctor studies unruly and unreasonable individuals. In other words, sometimes it's going to seem like Soviet leaders act like toddlers having a tantrum. Anyone who's had to deal with a child having a tantrum knows the worst thing you can do is get in the child's face and yell back. You might want to do it, but it's a bad move because all it does is escalate the situation. We have to not get emotional. We have to educate the public. We have to increase the health and vigor of our own society, right? Because what's communism going to do? They're going to prey on our weaknesses. They're going to point to things like poverty and racism. Everything that we can do to make this country a better place, he says, is a diplomatic victory over Moscow worth 1,000 diplomatic notes and joint communiques. We have to also emerge as leaders of the free world, right? They're looking to us for leadership. If we can't offer it, they'll look to the Russians as the second most powerful country in the world. Okay, and then finally, courage and self-confidence. Our society is good. Our institutions are good. Doesn't mean we don't have problems and that we shouldn't try to fix those problems, but we should cling to our own methods and conceptions of human society. We don't want to become like them and adopt their methods in trying to fight them. And that takes us through the long telegram. Now, Dr. Hadley.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Moser. I will, at first, getting off, look at Henry Wallace's kind of political career before getting into this speech that he gives in the fall of 1946. So Wallace is from Iowa. His family has a progressive Republican tradition. He and his father were both involved in the Food Administration Agency during World War I, which was run by Herbert Hoover, a not quite progressive Republican, but a Republican who was not of the kind of laissez-faire school of thought. Progressivism at this time, I think it's worth noting, is not really necessarily a coherent ideology. And that's important for kind of understanding where Wallace is coming from in terms of how to approach the Soviet Union. You have progressive Republicans as well as progressive Democrats. You have a kind of intermingling between ideas in these different parts of the parties and pulling in from some of the outer groups like socialism. So not embracing the entire agenda of socialism, but looking at some of the specific policies proposed by socialists, among other groups, as ways to essentially deal with the Industrial Revolution. Progressivism kind of emerges as this way of trying to meet the challenges of industrial life in the modern economy using reason and rationality. Now, sounds great in principle. There's some problems that the progressives get into in terms of, what counts as reason, as rationality, that we won't necessarily spend the time on here. What that's relevant for us in terms of Wallace's perspective is that Wallace is used to looking at a kind of almost pragmatist approach to things in terms of, you can grab a lot of different things from a lot of different intellectual and ideological kind of baskets to try and produce a more, basically stable society by making it a more equitable society. One of the kind of progressive goals is, in fact, kind of avoiding revolution by making what revolution is being fought over unnecessary. And this is going back to what Dr. Moser was saying about the Soviet hatred for the non-communist left, is because some progressives, not necessarily Wallace, but Walter Lippmann most notably, are very explicit about this. They're saying, like, look, there's a lot of reasons people have to be dissatisfied with life in a modern industrial economy. If those problems aren't addressed, then that is going to give ground to the most extreme voices in society, that it's going to increase the likelihood that there will be some kind of violent conflict. This leads to, some labor unions will be embraced by progressives and others won't be. And there's going to be a lot of, support for labor unions in the Franklin Roosevelt administration that Wallace works in, but they'll also have clashes with labor unions because what they really want, what the progressives in government want, is a labor union that is, focused mainly on getting material goods for its workers without a larger ideological agenda. And that will produce the kind of stability. So Wallace, if faced with the crisis of the Great Depression, faced with some of the arguments that he had within the Republican Party, becomes a Democrat and stumps for Franklin Delano Roosevelt throughout the 1930s, and he becomes the Secretary of Agriculture. Now, the Secretary of Agriculture is a very important position in the Roosevelt administration at the time, especially when you're dealing with, the collapse of agricultural markets following World War I, really. You have the Dust Bowl that had opened up in most notably Oklahoma, but large swaths of the center of the country. So agriculture is a major area for somebody to approach. And so Wallace gets this kind of experience, he gets well respected, and in 1940, he becomes Franklin Roosevelt's vice president. Or the vice presidential candidate, and then in 1941 becomes the vice president. And so Wallace is not close with Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't really keep his vice presidents tightly in the loop. Harry S. Truman, for example, didn't know that the atomic bomb was a thing until after he became president, when Roosevelt died. But Wallace is involved in war production. He's involved in kind of organizational efforts. But he's also on the left wing of the party at this point. And he gets kind of maneuvered out of the vice presidential slot in 1944. Harry S. Truman gets it, and there's some bad blood there. Wallace was unhappy with the fact that he had been replaced. And I think it's, not necessarily something we have the most documentation for, but it's worth considering, the perspective of somebody who would have been president of the United States and knows for a fact that he would have been president of the United States had he stayed on the ticket as vice president in 1944. So he and Truman aren't necessarily close. He initially stays within the administration as the Secretary of Commerce, and he had wanted Commerce. Roosevelt had basically offered him his choice of postings, and he'd wanted Commerce because he saw that department would be intimately involved in post-war policy. The United States has involved in setting up a variety of financial institutions in the post-war world to try and get an economic recovery, to try and prevent the reemergence of the kind of economic trends that followed World War I and then ultimately led to the Great Depression. The Bretton Woods system that the United States is kind of the key actor in, the cornerstone of this new economic order. All of these things Wallace sees as being important. And so he wants, from his position in commerce, to be able to help dictate what America's policy is going forward. At the same time, he's kind of emerged as the progressive champion for a lot of those who are kind of disappointed that Harry S. Truman was the one who succeeded Roosevelt because Truman was a more conservative Democrat. Though, I mean, all of these terms, like conservative or not, are kind of shifting with the times. Um, so Wallace is approaching the question of post-war policy largely from the perspective of how to most greatly increase cooperation in the world, how to, what are the ways that's most likely to create stability. And he's also someone who's on the kind of progressive side of things within the domestic political context, which matters a lot when we look at how Wallace actually begins this speech, The Way to Peace. There's a reason he's beginning in the domestic side of things. He also does not have the kind of experience with the Soviet Union that George Kennan had. It would be difficult for any politician who hadn't been part of the State Department to have Kennan's experience, but he had worked with some Soviet counterparts during World War II. He had taken a trip to the Soviet Union where they showed him one of their labor camps, and this was a mock-up. It was not an actual labor camp, which are these places that Soviets sent political prisoners to. People who might have been political prisoners, people who were taller than Joseph Stalin and happened to be standing near him at the wrong point in time. A lot of ways to end up in a Soviet labor camp. Those weren't the camps that Wallace saw. He saw what seemed like kind of model villages. There was a show that the Soviets were putting on for him. So he's more sympathetic to the Soviets, certainly, and to a large degree, that probably comes from his, lack of extensive experience with them that Kennan has. So to get to the actual speech that Wallace gives in September of 1946, and this will be kind of one of the speeches that helps mark the drift away from the Truman administration. He'll eventually leave the administration and be asked to leave the administration and challenge Truman for the presidency in 1948. So he's starting off by talking about conditions at home. So race prejudice, this is obviously a major issue. The civil rights movement, the kind of mass movement, is still some years off, but it's not it's not unknown to Americans before we see the mobilization of a mass movement that there's extreme racial disparity, racism within the United States, and not just in the American South, but particularly in the American South. The crisis of lynching that he's referencing here in Georgia, where there's a essentially ongoing crisis of violence against minorities, particularly, but not always, against African Americans. So there's cases of lynchings of Catholics, of Jews, of other, kind of other groups who aren't kind of counted in the American population. So Wallace is particularly concerned with condemning this and wants a presidency and a policy that's going to be more active in addressing problems within the United States. So racism, as he puts it, prejudice, hatred, fear, and ignorance, all of these things that need to be struggled against. In terms of applying this to international policy, Wallace is calling for the United States to help develop the underdeveloped areas of the world, to try and raise the standard of living generally. And this reflects some of that kind of old progressive idea that the greater stability will come from a general rise in living standards. It's also worth noting that Kennan and Truman aren't going to disagree with Wallace's idea that you do want to try and develop greater stability. The heart of the Marshall Program that will be announced, just a few months on from this, is that the United States is going to take a leading role in trying to rebuild the kind of global economy following World War II. So Wallace wants the United States to be playing this active role, and since he's still in the Truman administration, he's specifically attacking the Republicans. This is in the lead up to the 1946 midterm elections that the Republicans are ultimately going to, uh, you know, seize the control of Congress for the first time in a very long time. And he's kind of condemning the overall plank of the Republican Party, which he sees as being economically nationalist. He talks about the tariff. Wallace wants the United States to be engaged in more trade and more assistance in world affairs, kind of more integration in world affairs. So he is still kind of arguing that the Republican Party is the party of isolation, which, particularly after World War II, is a pretty strong dig at somebody, because the isolationists were those who had argued in the United States against getting involved in World War II. World War II breaks out in 1939. The United States doesn't get involved until December of 1941, when we're attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. So to kind of take on Republicans as being isolationist is to say here that they want to return to policy that had not worked. And he's basically framing reactionary positions as being the Republican positions. Now, he's doing this because he's still in the Truman administration, but he's going to be critical of Truman's policies on the same grounds that he's critical of the Republicans here in terms of how they approach the Soviet Union. Because there is a growing concern for Soviet action within the United States. And one of the particular areas that we're concerned with is what's happening in Eastern Europe. So the Eastern European countries that had been conquered by the Nazis and then ostensibly liberated by the Soviet Red Army, they all tend to have communist governments. Communists just prove very good, it turns out, at winning elections in Poland, for example. It turns out it's very easy to win an election that's, rigged as like just basically as possible. The Soviets do not have free and fair elections that in the areas under their control, they're putting in puppet communist regimes. This is something that Wallace recognizes. You'd have to be really naive to say that the communist government in Poland is representative of the Polish people. But he's drawing this argument here essentially that the Russians have a sphere of interest and that we have our own sphere of interest. So he's been critical in the past of US policy towards Latin America, for example. The United States has had in the past and will have in different ways in the future something of a habit of replacing governments in Latin America that are not cooperative with US ends. And so he draws a parallel between US policy towards Latin America to Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. And he's contrasting this with the British, who the Republicans want us to work with, to ally with, basically arguing that if we side with the British, we'll be taking on this imperialist stance. Britain is an imperial power, that we will be supporting reactionaries. And that rather than try and work out this kind of balance of power with the reactionary British, he argues that we have to be able to work with the Russians, that will be the most important thing. If we can convince the Russians that we're not a threat to them, if we respect, even if we don't like the things that they do within their sphere of interest, then he thinks that there will be a working relationship that will be possible. As he's arguing this especially critical paragraph, so this is on the second page and about the middle. He says, we should close our ears to those among us who would have us believe that Russian communism and our free enterprise system cannot live one with another in a profitable and productive peace. Under friendly, peaceful competition, the Russian world and the American world will gradually become more alike. The Russians will be forced to grant more and more of the personal freedom, and we shall become more and more absorbed with the problems of social economic justice. And as you can see in this, the crowd didn't really like that statement because they were a pro-Soviet crowd, and this the word forced. But what Wallace essentially is arguing here is that the American and Soviet systems are not destined to go to war with one another. are not destined to be in conflict. He believes that peaceful coexistence is possible on the basis of recognizing their own mutual interests, and that if we don't threaten the Russians, they won't be threatening to us, and over time, our systems will evolve. So essentially, in some ways, he's making an argument here about the Soviet Union that was made about China in the 1990s. That experience with the rest of the world, that trade with the world, um, over time the regime will soften. That over time the regime will become more receptive to the kind of personal liberty that we value within the United States. And he also thinks that kind of building off of the New Deal and this getting back to his domestic progressive agenda, that the United States will become a more equitable society in which there's a kind of even distribution. So Wallace kind of sees a convergence that will result in kind of greater equality and personal liberty. Uh, this is basically the idea of competition, he says here, being friendly, is we'll see which system works out the best. He's not necessarily arguing for communism. The pro-communist label that he gets, that's even included in this document, isn't necessarily accurately reflecting where Wallace is coming from, because it's not so much that he is pro-communist as that he thinks that um, an effort to confront them, an effort to fight communism with the forces of reaction will ultimately be counterproductive. That it will kind of lead us to not address problems in our society. This isn't something he necessarily addresses in this speech, but some of his other writings that he criticizes the cost that the United States will take on by playing an active role in the Cold War. Arguing that it's more important for the United States to focus on issues at home. But the other, the underlying assumption that it's useful to understand here about Wallace is, and the kind of critical difference that he has from Kennen is the ultimate assumption that the Soviets are a reasonable government that it will be possible to negotiate. Essentially, you can see even some areas where Wallace and Kennen would align. Kennen talking about the need to improve our own society so as not to kind of leave diseased tissue for communism to grow in. But what this core difference is about whether or not you can work out a reasonable relationship with the Soviets if you don't threaten them, for example, if you don't challenge what they're doing in Eastern Europe on account of their own security. It's not something that's necessarily what Wallace would be familiar with at the time. But even before it gets a name, the idea is kind of there of a concept known as the security dilemma, which is that if you take action that you view as defensive, an opponent of yours might take it as a threat to them, and then in turn will do things to build up their own defenses. And that would create the kind of spiraling escalation of tension, which leads to his last paragraph by saying that by confronting Russia in this way, it will determine whether we not in one world or two worlds, but whether we live at all. So what he's basically calling for is efforts to cooperate and coexist with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and kind of trust in this eventual evolution of our societies in a ultimately positive way. Now, just as a brief note before opening this back up to everybody, to get some questions in, is Wallace comes to you know reject his own argument here. 1952, he writes an article entitled "I Was Wrong." Um, Part of that might have been some of his own experiences in the 1948 presidential campaign, where there were a lot of so-called fellow travelers or communist sympathizers or communist organizations that were involved in his campaign. He became the owner of the New Republic magazine, and the editor of that, Michael Straight, had been an NKVD agent for many years. So kind of finding out just how thoroughly infiltrated some of the institutions within the United States were definitely changed his perspective on the Soviet Union. But right here in 1946, addressing the issue of policy, is Wallace is arguing for engagement rather than confrontation. Uh, So kind of not containment in the sense of the logic of force that Kennen talked about, but still trying to appeal to a logic of reason to the Soviets. Uh, that's Wallace's way to peace speech.
Anyone have questions for us? Oh, I think there are two of them. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can make this smaller and see the questions more. Okay, Catherine London asks, so why in the end did Kennen's diplomatic career receive a boost when he was named a U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union? I thought America was not fully thankful that Kennen revealed his opinions. Or did America approve of containment of Soviet expansion? Kennen didn't actually become ambassador to the Soviet Union until 1952. His official position in the late 30s and into the 40s was chargé d'affaires, sort of the second in command at the embassy. In fact, he the first U.S. ambassador was a guy named Davies, and Kennen thought he was a complete idiot because he was falling for the Soviet for Soviet propaganda. In any case, when he well, I'm assuming you're not talking about when he became ambassador. He became important, but when he was just first sent to the Soviet Union. He was sent there because he knew a lot more about Russia than the vast majority of Foreign Service officers did at the time, from his time at Riga, which is Latvia. Not to offend any Latvians or Estonians, I just confused the two. So Kennen goes to Moscow. I guess I don't 100% understand the question, although hardly anyone knows in the United States knew who Kennen was until not even the long telegram, because the long telegram was classified. Only people in the higher levels of the administration saw that. But then the following year, he published in a journal called Foreign Policy, still around today, an article called "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," where he basically made the same arguments, but it was more of a polished. It was an article for publication, so he put various things in. He signed that article Mr. X. No one was supposed to know it was Kennen, but anybody who had seen the long telegram and read this said, "Oh, okay, this is obviously Kennen." So soon it was the worst kept secret out there. And Kennen starts being looked to as this guru, the guy who really gets the Soviet Union and who really knows what the United States needs to do. And for maybe a year or so, he was really looked upon. He really had this top-notch reputation. But it wasn't long before he started complaining about the way people were understanding containment. His argument was, look, I never said that the Soviet Union wanted war. They weren't going to try war. And too much of our response to Soviet provocation is to build up the army and navy, to develop a bunch of atomic weapons, to set up bases around the world, to create military alliances. Look, there might be some good reason for those things, but the danger is if we look at this contest as primarily a matter is mainly a military contest, we're going to emphasize the wrong things. It's not ultimately, I mean, they could make it a military contest, but they're not going to do it. The idea that Stalin's going to unleash the Red Army and to attack Western Europe, it's not going to happen. What they're going to do is mess around politically. They're going to spread propaganda. They're going to try to discredit foreign leaders who oppose them. It's all stuff like that. So really, our response needs to be political. It ought to be aimed at at assisting other countries that are trying to get back up on their feet. So the Marshall Plan was something that Kennen was a big fan of. But he always thought that the administrations, even starting with Truman, were looking too much at this as a military thing and not enough as a political. I hope that kind of answers the question.
I see a question about how Wallace's presidential bid ended, which I think actually, I'm glad you mentioned the Marshall Program, because that kind of was part of it, is that Truman, in some ways, got to the left, further left than he was initially, and that kind of deflated a lot of Wallace's appeal. So embarking on the Marshall Plan, which he's essentially calling on something like that in this speech, and the fact that he, for example, was calling for measures to address racism. Truman has greater support for civil rights, desegregates the military. So he's not really forced out. He ends up with a very disappointing, I think, at 2.5% of the popular vote. Doesn't win any electoral college votes. Truman was challenged in two directions within the Democratic Party in 1948. There's Wallace on his left, and then there's Southern Democrats who were angry about some of the steps he had taken for kind of greater racial justice, desegregation especially. So the Dixiecrat, the Southern Democrat nicknamed Strom Thurmond, runs against him. And because of that, everybody thought Truman was going to lose to the Republican challenger, Dewey, which leads to this famous incident of the Chicago Tribune printing ahead of time, Dewey beats Truman, but then Truman ultimately managed to win unexpectedly in the 48 election. And Wallace was kind of, he was still around, but he was kind of spent as a political force after 1948. He pops up here and there, but doesn't really take on a major role after 1948.
Emma Bromley Perry asks, why do you all suppose that Truman preferred Kennen's approach to Wallace's? This is because Truman was convinced there was a problem with the Soviet Union from the beginning. In fact, even in his last days on this planet, FDR started in some of his correspondence was expressing worry about what the Soviets were up to. So this is bad stuff. Truman comes into office and is immediately convinced that the Soviets are breaking promises that they had made. So here are two ways of answering the question. One was Kennen's, that, look, this is in their nature. This is how they're going to behave because they don't think there's any future of long-term cooperation. Wallace's answer was, well, it's our fault. Which would you, if you were president, which would you rather listen to?
And Truman had experience dealing with things that Wallace would have been aware of, but that I think went under the radar for a lot of Americans. Like the Soviets essentially tried to seize a republic create a socialist republic out of territory they were occupying in Iran, for example, and that was like right after the war ends. So just, I think, interacting with the Soviet Union gives you a better sense of what Soviet power is like.
Harbor Wolf asks, did Kennen support Vietnam as popular interest died out? Kennen always thought Vietnam was a bad idea. Now, here's something I should point out to you. George Kennen lived until 2005. He lived to the age of 101. And every time something happened in foreign policy, you could always count on some journalist going and asking George Kennen what he thought about it. So he weighed in on the Iraq War. In the late 90s, he weighed in on when the Clinton administration wanted to expanded NATO into Eastern Europe. And the fact is, he didn't like much of anything in U.S. policy. He certainly thought that Vietnam was a waste of resources. In fact, he said in his memoirs that his idea of containment was only really intended to apply to the Soviet Union under Stalin. And that after Stalin's death, and then of course there were a few years when it wasn't sure who was going to take over. But once Khrushchev was in charge, Kennen would say to the rest of his life, that the United States missed an opportunity for genuinely better relations because the United States would not recognize that Khrushchev, although an unlovable character in many respects, was not Stalin, and we could have worked with Khrushchev in a way that we couldn't have worked with Stalin. Would care to add to that, Professor Hadley?
Yeah, I think one of the other things that comes out in Kennen's other writings is basically Kennen's always concerned about what you actually can do practically and where you should focus your efforts. So I identified areas that he thought were particularly key that we would want to prevent communism from expanding into. So Japan, which had been this, it was in ruins after World War II, but it wasn't going to be it didn't take a great leap of the imagination to see that it was going to emerge as another economic power. Western Europe. So Kennan was arguing that where we needed to pay the most attention to was areas that kind of mattered most to the overall economic working of the world. So he didn't think that Vietnam was worth the amount of assets the United States put into it. He didn't have the idea necessarily that you had to contain communism everywhere. If Vietnam goes over to the communists, he doesn't think that really changes the balance of power in the world between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Okay, Grace Walker asks, is the long telegram where the USA got the notion of being responsible for being a world leader on all fronts in modern times? I mean, here's something I like to tell students all the time. How much can change in 10 years? In 1940, Germany overran France. And while Americans were upset by that, virtually no one was saying, wow, the United States better send troops to protect Europe from Hitler. Of course, eventually the United States got in, but it wasn't over the fate of France. 10 years later, 1950, North Korean troops invade South Korea. Immediately, the response is, we have to send troops to defend South Korea, right? Not France 10 years ago wasn't worth the investment of American lives, but Korea 10 years later is. So it's clear there's a big change that goes on in those 10 years. Pearl Harbor had a lot to do with it. If it were Kennen's idea that the United States should do this, Kennen saw that as a fundamental misreading of what he meant, because Kennen did not, for reasons that Professor Hadley just pointed out, Kennen never thought that every part of the world could or should be defended from the Soviets. Western Europe, absolutely. Japan, absolutely. Vietnam, some fights aren't worth the investment of lives and resources. More important, I think, than the long telegram was a speech that Harry Truman gave in 1947, where he enunciated what became known as the Truman Doctrine, where he said that I believe it should be the policy of the United States to support free peoples wherever they are oppressed by, wherever they fear foreign aggression or internal or some internal minority wants to take them over. I totally mangled that, but the whole sense of it is we should be supporting free peoples. The implication was everywhere in the world. When Kennen heard that speech, he said, "Oh, hell no! I mean, this is not what I meant." But a lot of people were willing to draw a straight line from Kennen to the Truman Doctrine speech.
And I think that also a lot of the power from Truman in that moment. That I think that that's a good moment if you want to locate. If there's one moment that you have to say, when does the Cold War start? I think that the Truman Doctrine is as good a candidate as a lot of others that you could select. But he's also drawing on the terms that the U.S. used to fight in World War II, that Roosevelt articulated even before we were involved in the conflict, this idea of, what are the freedoms in the world that the United States is going to stand for? What are the values that we're going to be trying to fight for in fighting Nazi Germany? And so the kind of internationalism of Roosevelt's approach in fighting Nazism, I think, kind of translated to this broader approach that Truman takes in fighting communism.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks, John and Dave, for being with us today, and I thank all of you for coming. This webinar will be archived on teachingamericanhistory.org's YouTube channel within the next few days if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with someone. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please look into Ashbrook's summer programs for high school students, the Ashbrook Academies. They're week-long programs, usually held on our campus in Ashland, Ohio, but we recently made the decision we'll be conducting this summer's academies using an online format. We're still working out the details of that, and so any of you who have already applied for this summer, you'll be getting more news on that sometime soon. But regardless of the format, the academies will include a lot of discussions like you heard here today, using primary sources to explore the past and understand history through the eyes of those who lived it. If you're interested, please visit ashbrookacademy.org for more info on that. Also want to mention that if you're considering majoring in history or political science in college, Ashland University is a particularly good place for you. If you come to Ashland, you'll be taught by professors like Dr. Mosier and Hadley every day. And if you want more information about that program, visit ashbrookscholar.org. If you're a senior and still undecided about where you'll be attending next fall, we still have slots for 2020. Let's see, our next webinar will take place a week from today on Thursday, April 16th, when our topic will be Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education, the beginning and end of 60 years of racial segregation. Joining us to lead a discussion of those two Supreme Court cases will be Dr. Jeff Sittinga and Dr. Chris Perkett. So look forward to seeing you all back here then. Thanks, guys.